History as it happens, May 20th, 2021, 1619 versus 1776.
Critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and the crusade against American history is toxic propaganda.
Republican lawmakers are trying to block schools from teaching your kids the 1619 Project. But it's not only right-wing culture warriors who say it's bunk. We'll look at what it gets right and wrong about our past and why it matters as we report History as it Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
There are a lot of exotic notions about what are the most important points in American history. I simply disagree with the notion that the New York Times laid out there that the year 1619 was one of those years.
When your kids are in school, should they be taught divisive nonsense? That's how Senate Republicans, in a letter to Education Secretary Miguel Cardona, described a proposed rule by the Biden administration. It promotes programs that focus on systemic racism and the legacy of slavery, such as the 1619 Project. Federal grant applicants have to support the creation of what are called identity-safe learning environments. The Republicans' letter said Americans never decided our children should be taught that our country is inherently evil. Here's Minority Leader Mitch McConnell.
I just simply don't think that's part of the core underpinning of what American civic education ought to be about.
Well, they agree in Oklahoma, where the legislature passed a bill banning the 1619 Project from school curriculum. Texas is thinking of doing the same, and Tennessee is working on similar legislation. So the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning work is now a battleground in America's culture wars. But it's not only conservatives who are angry about this. Some of the most prominent historians in the country say the 1619 Project was loaded with factual mistakes and warped interpretations, such as an opening essay claiming one of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect slavery. Well, that's a fairly dramatic rewriting of our origin story. And that idea apparently came in part from a book written by historian Gerald Horne, The Counter-Revolution of 1776. Now, that title is itself an argument. The colonists weren't the rebels. They were, in Horne's view, closer to reactionaries, going to war before the mother country might do away with slavery. Horne pointed to an English court decision in 1772 known as the Somerset Decision. No one could be forcibly removed from Britain and sold into slavery. Here is Horne explaining why he believed that was important to the colonists at a New York Times panel discussion on the 1619 Project.
It's a case out of England in the early 1770s that cast doubt upon the viability, shall we say, of slavery in England going forward. There was nervousness and apprehension as to whether or not this decision would leapfrog the Atlantic. After all, these 13 colonies were under London's jurisdiction. And of course, that decision was ultimately followed in Scotland, for example. And once again, as the planters are surveying the landscape, I think they have good reason to suspect that London, which had been, as I said, they had been relying upon Africans to a certain degree in their other colonies, might be predisposed to having Africans discipline these settlers in Virginia.
The man sitting next to Horne on that panel was University of Virginia historian Alan Taylor. He is our guest today.
I don't agree with all of the details, but I've consulted with them, and they've been very responsive in trying to get things right.
My conversation with Alan Taylor is coming up in a moment. He has a more favorable view of the 1619 Project than some other scholars, namely Sean Wilentz. In an essay in The Atlantic, Wilentz wrote, assertions that a primary reason the Revolution was fought to protect slavery are as inaccurate as the assertion, still current, that Southern secession and the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. So the Times editors eventually clarified that initial claim, so it now says only some of the colonists revolted to protect slavery, some of them. But some major historians say that clarification doesn't cut it, because several errors and misleading statements are still up on the New York Times webpage, even after the critics pointed out that there is no statement from any colonist saying he wanted to declare independence to protect slavery, not even after the Dunmore Edict in 1775, which we'll get to in a moment. Also, the British anti-slavery movement only got going in 1787 after the war. There weren't growing calls in Britain to end the Atlantic slave trade before 1776. It was Americans who demanded the slave trade be abolished. Leslie Harris, who teaches African American studies at Northwestern University, wrote in Politico that slavery in the colonies faced no immediate threat from Great Britain. And the main point of her essay was the New York Times ignored her warnings about printing avoidable mistakes. But there is more to this controversy than getting our facts straight, although that is important enough. It runs deeper because origin stories matter. Was America founded on freedom and liberty or racism and white supremacy? Historian Margaret Macmillan, in her book Dangerous Games, The Use and Abuses of History, wrote, "We argue over history in part because it can have real significance in the present. We use it in a variety of ways, to mobilize ourselves to achieve goals in the future, to make claims, for land, for example, and sadly to attack and belittle others. Examining the past can be a sort of therapy as we uncover knowledge about our own societies that has been overlooked or repressed." That's Margaret Macmillan. So we all seek a usable past, but the remedy for incorrect or oversimplified interpretations of history is not to create a competing fable. I mentioned Sean Wilentz before. He'll be back on the podcast next episode. We'll briefly address the 1619 Project in a larger discussion about the importance of civics education. But Sean and I will mainly talk about the resuscitation of the Democrats under Biden and how they could get tangled up in these culture wars. Today, as mentioned, we're going to talk to a historian who takes a more favorable view of the 1619 Project and disagrees with some of these criticisms. Alan Taylor, Thomas Jefferson Foundation Chair at the University of Virginia, and the author of The Internal Enemy, Slavery and War in Virginia, 1772 to 1832, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Alan Taylor, welcome.
Well, thank you, Martin. It's nice to be here.
Let's begin with the 1619 Project generally speaking, before we get to any of its specific claims. What was your initial reaction to it as a scholar who specializes in this field of early American history?
My initial response was positive, and it remains positive. I think it's an important contribution to how we think about history in this country. I don't agree with all of the details, but I've consulted with them, and they've been very responsive in trying to get things right. And they recognize that the first time through that there were some things that they overstated, and I think they're working very hard to try to improve it as they go along.
So let's discuss one of those initial problems. The New York Times released what it called an update, not a correction, to its initial claim that one of the primary causes of the American Revolution was to preserve slavery against an abolitionist Britain. This appeared, at least to my eyes, as a preposterous claim, but I'm no historian. So what did you think of that?
I think what you just said is overstated on their part. But there's been some shift in their position. I think initially it was, yes, this is the primary cause of the American Revolution. It has since shifted to, this is one of the causes of the American Revolution. White Southerners to the Somerset Case, and even more importantly, to Dunmore's proclamation offering freedom to enslaved people who would run away and join him and fight on the British cause. So I do think, especially Dunmore's proclamation, is extremely important. So that's the second shoe. The first shoe is the Somerset decision. So the Somerset decision alone is not what's upsetting Patriot leaders. What's upsetting them is that some British commanders are trying to exploit the presence of enslaved people in the colonies as a way to rouse up rebellion and thereby weaken the Patriot cause. And that's a very serious thing. And it is very important to rallying Southerners for the Patriot cause.
At least those Southerners who are going to join the rebellion. The Southerners that remain loyal did not have to worry about losing their slaves in the Dunmore Edict, right?
Correct. Yeah, no, it was just if you are in the possession of a patriot and you run away and join the British cause, then you will be freed.
Let's go back to the Somerset case. That's a big part of the dispute over the 1619 Project's claims about the Revolution. Somerset Case 1772 says chattel slavery is not recognized in English common law. In an essay in The Atlantic, the great historian Sean Wilentz says, this case did not cause a sensation, so there was no sensation in the colonies, contrary to what the authors of the 1619 Project claimed, and at least one historian claimed, Gerald Horne, who wrote a book arguing the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery. What's your take?
Well, I agree that Sean Wilentz is a great historian, but I don't agree with his statement that it doesn't cause a sensation. Now, it depends on your definition of sensation. 20 newspapers published the Somerset case. Sean doesn't see that as a significant number. For me, that's a pretty significant number, given that there were about 80 newspapers in the colonies at the time. So the Somerset case alone is not what really agitates patriots. What agitates patriots is some enslaved people learn about the Somerset decision and they translate it into a piece of folklore, which is that the king is coming to liberate them. They start talking about that. And that alarms patriot leaders who overhear this. And it leads them to overreact to enslaved people and to start really cracking down. It's really the way that enslaved people react to the Somerset decision that is more important than how newspapers responded to the Somerset decision.
And then afterwards, we have the Dunmore Edict. Dunmore was the colonial governor of Virginia. Mm-hmm. He said slaves that reach British lines will be free, and that is seen as a possible tipping point for some colonists. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, in all of the causes of the Revolution, how important was this one edict?
It's extremely important. You get people like George Washington calling Dunmore a monster and urging his assassination. You have Thomas Jefferson saying that this put the colony of Virginia into a frenzy. You have Richard Henry Lee, who says that this has united the gentry class, the leading class in Virginia, has united them in support of the Revolution. You have Edward Rutledge in South Carolina saying this has done more than anything else to draw most of the gentry class in support of the patriots in South Carolina. So it causes a sensation.
At this point, the rebellion's already underway, though, isn't it?
That's correct. But this is in this limbo period, very important limbo period. Americans do not declare their independence in 1775. They are fighting the king and his troops, but they are seeking reconciliation. And there are lots of wavering people. Americans are not united in support of the revolution in 1775. There are a lot of people who are loyalists. There are even more people who are wavering in the middle. They just want this crisis to go away. So this is a very important period, 1775, late 1775, early 1776. And that's when Dunmore's proclamation comes out.
But even before the Declaration of Independence in 1776, weren't the colonies in effect declaring independence by forming parallel governments? What was happening there that was important?
They do set up extra-legal governments in the form of provincial congresses at the colony level and of committees at the county and in some cases town level. And then there is the overall Continental Congress, which is not really a government, but more of a coordinating body of these colonies. All of these leaders, though, are saying that they're doing so just to resist British taxes and the coercive acts, and that if Britain will withdraw these things, then they will reconcile and they will continue under the British Empire. And they also petition the king in the Olive Branch petition, seeking Britain's concessions and offering to return to loyalty to the British Empire if the British will do that. This is a very transition period where it's not at all clear that it's going to culminate in independence, although growing numbers of people, particularly early in 1776, start to trend that way.
So given what you've said here, why do you think this claim caused such an uproar, other than maybe the obvious, that it rewrites the history of the Revolution that all of us were taught at one point or another?
Right. Well, that is concerning to people, is there are institutions and values that have been at the core of American civic identity involving liberty and equality. And we very much look to the founding generation as heroes who helped to frame these institutions and these values. And so it can be very disturbing to restore those people to their own social context, one in which slavery was normative, in which enslaved people were 1/5 of Americans. And slavery is a nasty system. And so to kind of bring into the foreground the same people who are writing these great documents and founding these great institutions and laying out these core principles were also holding enslaved people and also doing things that tended to prolong the system of slavery at the same time that they were expressing criticisms of that slavery. That's a very complex history, and it can be very troubling. And it can lead some people to the extreme opposite end, to say that the whole thing is corrupt from the start. And it can be tough then for a historian to try to say, let's just look at the whole picture, the whole context, good and bad at the same time.
That's right, there was a backlash against the 1619 Project on the right. But the historians I've mentioned here, such as Sean Wilentz, Gordon Wood was also critical. They're not right-wingers, they're great scholars. So Alan Taylor, as a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian yourself, where do you place that claim about slavery and the Revolution in, say, a causal hierarchy of the war?
Well, let me just say, I admire Sean and I admire Gordon a great deal. We don't obviously always agree about things. I think in this particular case, I don't want to speculate about what motivated them to do it. I will say that Sean has cared very much about politics in contemporary America from a liberal perspective. And I've read his piece in The Atlantic, and I can see that he's troubled by something that seems to undermine what he sees as the liberal tradition in American politics in a very broad way that he sees as continuous from the Revolution. And it's evident from that piece that he is troubled by the suggestion the American Revolution was primarily fought to consolidate slavery. I agree that if you say it was primarily fought to consolidate slavery, that is not true. It is true, however, that at the end of the Revolution, the slave system in the colonies is expanding in the South and will become stronger than ever before. At the same time, in the northern states, there is a slow movement toward gradual emancipation. So if you want to say the American Revolution was one thing, and it had one primary cause, and that cause was something that all Americans agreed on, I would say that's not the American Revolution. The American Revolution is a coalition that crosses regions and unites many different people who have different motives for it. And some of those people were troubled by the British Empire's meddling in colonial affairs. And one of the ways in which the British meddled was troubling to Southern slaveholders. And I think that's very important to pay attention to. Now, do I think that's the primary cause of the revolution for the largest number of Americans? No, I don't. But I do think that what unites them as a coalition is the belief that the British Parliament is acting as a sovereign legislature and interfering in colonial affairs in new ways. These include heavier taxes. These include vetoing measures by certain colonies, including Virginia, to tax slave imports. And they include the prospect that perhaps, and this was a fear, it was not a reality, perhaps the British Parliament is going to interfere in slave relations. What form that would take, nobody knows, because Parliament hadn't actually done anything. But the people who are leading the American Revolution have very powerful imaginations, and they imagine the British as interfering, meddling, tyrannical, and they expected worse was to come.
And the leaders of the revolution believed they would be enslaved by Parliament when that was not the case. They would be colonists, but not literal slaves.
Well, again, it depends on your meaning of slavery. And they played very fast and loose with that word. So they said, if Parliament can tax us, Parliament will keep taxing us. And that will put us in a situation of slavery. Well, probably not literally out in the fields. But what they meant was, you are either a dependent person or you are an independent person. An independent person owns his own property. If some other group of men has the capacity to take away some of your property, then you are on the path to dependence. And in the future, you will be less and less free. And they could point to, for example, all of these tenants in Ireland or elsewhere in Britain who had to pay very high rents and very high taxes. And they said that's a form of dependence that we could be led to if our own colonies do not have sovereign legislatures.
18th century contexts. Thank you for pointing that out. There is another criticism of the 1619 Project, that it gets the story only half right. Yes, there were pro-slavery factions, but there were also anti-slavery factions and eventually an abolitionist movement.
I do believe that we need to pay very close attention to the anti-slavery tradition, as well as paying attention to the pro-slavery tradition. The two both emerged out of the Revolution. Both were strengthened by the Revolution, and they both contested for essentially what will be the soul of America going forward. And that is a struggle that continues on through the Civil War.
In the North, in the colonies, and then the original states, slavery was either abolished or, more commonly, there were gradual emancipation laws that were passed, meaning you would keep somebody in bondage for, say, the first 25 years of their life, and then they would be free after that, so well into the 1820s. To our modern eyes, that may not seem like much, but at the time, these were major pieces of legislation.
Yeah, again, it's your perspective. This is pretty dramatic. Slavery is more or less instantly ended in Massachusetts by a court decision in 1783. Elsewhere, the norm in the northern colonies was for a legislature to pass a law that says, if you're a slave right now, you will remain a slave for the rest of your life. But people born after this date will become free when they get into their 20s. And it varies, which year it will be, and it varies by gender. These are laws that don't free a single slave when they're passed. They will only free slaves down the road, 20 plus years. But it sets out a dynamic where a lot of masters in the North say, I'll work out a deal with you. If you work hard for me for 10 years and turn over your wages that you make when I hire you out, then I'll free you. So these laws set in motion the very gradual emancipation of enslaved people. It does so primarily at the cost of the labor of those enslaved people who have to work. They're in effect buying their own freedom, but they're given the option to buy their own freedom by working for, up to 26, 27 more years. Now, we could ask ourselves, how would any of us feel today if we were told, you get to stay in slavery and you're going to have to work for 25 to 27 years to become free? That would be quite a burden, because these are prime years, particularly when you're from about 15 on into the mid-20s. These are prime years of labor. And these are still being taken away from enslaved people in these northern states under these laws.
And by the time of the Civil War, there's something like 4 million slaves in the United States. I'd like to get your take on the following. Some of the critics on the right say the problem with the 1619 Project is it places the same lens over all of American history, and that is everything must be viewed through the lens of white supremacy, a conflict between the races.
They do say that, their wounded pleas would be more persuasive if in the past they had shown some leadership about saying we really have to have a reckoning about slavery and racism in this country. As far as I can tell, they were absolutely silent on this until they feel wounded when somebody comes from the other extreme and says, this is the be-all, end-all of American history. I'm in the middle of this, I believe, maybe I'm not. I do think that we cannot write a true American history unless we place at the center of our history the relationship of the races. It is not just black and white, but it's also Native Americans. And then increasingly in the 20th century, it will be people who are Hispanic and of different races. And then Asians as well. I mean, the whole Chinese exclusion issue in the late 19th century, early 20th century So we've had a very long-standing problem with race in this country. So one of the ways in which the 1619 Project is incomplete, it is just about the black-white relationship, which you can say, if we have to say which of the racial relations has been the most fundamental, yes, that is. But there have been racial issues of many sorts in our history that have made it much more difficult for us to realize the full potential of our creed, which seeks liberty and equality for all. And I do think we have to pay attention to that. And I think the 1619 Project, on balance, contributes to it. I don't think just a categorical dismissal of it has been helpful. And so I've tried to be constructively engaged with it to identify the ways in which overstatement has not served their fundamental purpose well.
Do you believe historians have a role to play in public discourse? I think social media is acting to reel a lot of historians in, especially when it comes to subjects like the 1619 Project. I don't know if you're active on Twitter or not, but what role do academic historians have to play in all this?
Well, I think historians should play a role. I think what we bring to public discourse is a kind of depth perception in time about where we're at and how we got here. So I would hope that historians would weigh in. I don't have a presence in Twitter. You're able to look at me because we're doing this by Zoom. Your listeners won't. I'm getting on there in the years. I'm not a Twitter guy. I think any discourse that's reduced to, 140 characters is not a great service. Now, there are historians who are very good at it, and I applaud them. I'm glad they do it. It's not for me. I'm not sure on balance that our discourse is improved by our inability to explore things in depth and with nuance, which are things that are impossible with those kinds of lengths. So I do think there's ways in which the social media of today gins everything up. It's gotcha. You said this, there's this particular fact, it's wrong, and it goes back and forth, and I'm not sure it's getting us anywhere. So I welcome the chance on this podcast that you can ask me, these questions, and I give you the best answers I can, and we try to explore these things and see that history is very complicated, but it's extremely interesting.
And it matters so much to who we are today. I think
absolutely.
Some of the 1619 Project controversy is who gets to tell the story of history.
And you asked the question, should it be taught in schools? Sure. Should it be the only thing taught in schools? No. I think it would be helpful to teach the 1619 Project and to have that Atlantic Monthly essay side by side, have students read these things. I do think you need some preparation for students. I'm not sure that the 1619 Project would work well in elementary schools or even in junior high, but I think if you got into high school and people had some basic understanding of American history, and then to expose them to this controversy and to see that there are different ways we tell our history. There's a liberal tradition, there's a conservative tradition, and with the 1619 Project, this is a radical tradition of telling our history. It's one radical tradition, it's not the only one. To see that these different traditions are, how they differ from each other, why they differ from each other, and what consequences they will have, I think could be a very important thing for students to learn.
Yeah, it's not like students are getting a great version of history right now, although I must admit it's been a long time since I've been in a high school classroom. But I think one criticism of the way history is taught is that it's not done critically, and you get this glorified, idealized version of the American Revolution with the heroes of Yorktown and Valley Forge, when it's a little bit more complicated than that.
And it's a lot more interesting when you make it more complicated. I've done a lot of work with K-12 teachers and with students in high school. And they're bored by the traditional story because it doesn't seem real. It's like people are put up on pedestals as heroes, and they just don't seem like real human beings struggling with the kinds of conflicts that political and social life inevitably bring. So if we can make history truer, we make it more interesting, and we will have a bigger impact on young people. People who want to jump all over the 1619 Project, well, where are you when the Texas School Board adopts textbooks that say that slaves were just immigrants? There are a lot of things out there that we might disagree with in their particulars, and we should look at them carefully. But it's very important for us to have an open discussion about differences in how we interpret the past and why we interpret them differently. And if we do that, we'll be in a much better place in this country.
In closing, my take on the 1619 Project, whatever disagreements really good historians may have about some of its claims, was the publishers were saying, we've been talking about 1776 all the time. Let's try it this way.
Yeah, I mean, in 1619 is in a way is arbitrary because there were Spanish and French colonies here in North America well before 1619. There was slavery here before 1619, existed among native peoples and among the Spanish. But 1619 is a very important moment. The purpose, as I understand it, of the 1619 Project is to be provocative. Is to say, look, when you write about 1776 and you say it's the unfolding of this country that began perfect and has been getting better ever since, well, you're leaving out that even if we go to 1619 and say that's a foundational moment, then you're saying, look, the story is really about race relations in America. And these ideals and these institutions to promote liberty and equality, they have been wrestling with racial realities from the very start, long before 1776, and we're still wrestling with them today. And I think that's a very constructive contribution by the 1619 Project.
Alan Taylor of the University of Virginia, thank you for your insights today. On the next episode of History as It Happens, Sean Wilentz returns to talk about the resuscitation of the Democrats.
The era of big government is over.
Joe Biden is going big. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.